This week on Inside Olympia, is there any room left in politics for moderates? And what is the future of the Republican Party in Washington state? On the program, former Secretary of State Sam Reed and Chief Historian John Hughes to discuss the new book, Mr. Mainstream, Sam Reed's Half-Century of Public Service and Civility.
From the TVW studio, it's Inside Olympia with host Austin Jenkins.
And welcome to Inside Olympia. He dedicated his life to public service and burnished a reputation as a moderate Republican in the mold of Dan Evans. Now he's the subject of a new book, Mr. Mainstream, Sam Reed's Half-Century of Public Service and Civility. Joining me now, and for the full hour this week, to talk about his career and the current state of politics, and some history too, is former Washington Secretary of State Sam Reed, along with the author of the new book on him, historian John Hughes of the Legacy Washington program within the Secretary of State's office. Great to see you both. Nice to see you both together.
Thank you, Austin. Thank you.
And congratulations on the book as the subject and as the author of
Thank
this
you, sir.
undertaking. There's a little symmetry here, perhaps, or come full circle moment, and maybe I'll start with you, John Hughes, because you've been the chief historian of this program for many years now. It is under the auspices of the Secretary of State's office. You have written books on former Governor Booth Gardner, former Senator Slade Gordon, but now you wrote a book about the man who hired you.
You know, history does come full circle. It was 16 years ago that when I was the editor and publisher of the Daily World at Aberdeen, the company that owned the newspaper was pressuring me to make more and more cuts that I found unpalatable. And I was looking for a job when David Ammons told me that Secretary Reed wanted to talk to me about a new oral history program that he and State Representative then, Sam Hunt, later State Senator, organized. The legislature heretofore had an oral history program that covered only former legislators. And the two Sams, old friends from Washington State University, thought that shortchanged former statewide elected officials, former members of Congress, former members of the judiciary. And then this wonderful line, I don't know which of you wrote it, but there's a wonderful line in that legislation that says, and other Washingtonians from all walks of life who have made an indelible contribution to Washington state history. I cut my pay in half to take this job. It's the best decision I ever made. It was an absolutely amazing person to work for, and it's been a very satisfying 16 years.
And many books and many oral interviews in the intervening 16 years. What's it like to be the subject of one of these books? You've introduced these books over the years at events to launch book launches, but now you are the subject of your own book.
Well, in some ways it's harder. You can watch him do it with others and all that, but of course also it's a testing of your memory and giving a perspective that is going to be helpful in terms of capturing some of the history, which I think is so important, and that's the reason for doing this. It wasn't necessarily personal about me, but I was delighted when Secretary of State Kim Wyman and John Hughes decided they would do this, because I do think that during the course of these 35 years, we really did make history, and I'm glad that it's been captured in this book.
And there were historic moments and events along the way. We'll talk about some of them. I hold up the book here. It is, as I've said, called Mr. Mainstream. And I just want to start with that because we cannot ignore the fact that we are talking right before a national and state election. We are also talking in very, very polarized times when being mainstream, being moderate, does not seem to be in vogue. And so I'd just like you to reflect for a moment on the sort of pattern of practice that you established in your years of public office and how that compares and contrasts to the times we find ourselves in.
I was fortunate to grow up in a family that was engaged in politics. My grandfather was a state legislator, a prosecuting attorney, state chair of the Republican Party, and a moderate Republican. And my mother was too. My father, much more conservative. And as I got engaged a little bit more as I got older, and then particularly before graduate school, and Dan Evans was running for governor the first time, I met him. I immediately was excited about his candidacy, inspired by what he had to say, his pragmatic politics, his vision, his civility, his moderation. And so I got very engaged in that, and really that set the tone. And then through the years, he was a role model, as well as Joel Pritchard was a role model, former congressman and legislator. Attorney General Slade Gorton was, and Secretary of State Lud Kramer. So, I would add also Jim Dolliver, who was a Supreme Court justice, but I reported to because he's chief of staff for Dan Evans, and Jim Dolliver was just a remarkable man. So I was really fortunate, Austin. Look at these role models that I had that started me off in my political career.
So those were the role models, and that became kind of your guiding principle for how to govern, especially governing elections, governing, holding offices that lent themselves in many ways to being more moderate and more bipartisan in your approach. That said, I'd like to have you reflect on the times we're in as we have this conversation, which again don't seem to favor this idea of being a little bit more middle of the road.
That is true, and we've seen throughout American history there are times like this, and then the pendulum swings, and it comes back to more the big political middle and people working together, more bipartisanship and such, and I'm quite optimistic that's going to be the case again. But I'm not just sitting and hoping. I'm still very engaged in the mainstream Republicans of Washington, and we're out recruiting candidates very successfully for the legislature, for local offices, and also we're going to be in very good position here in the state of Washington when the pendulum does swing again.
What do you think about this, John Hughes, as a longtime journalist, now historian, someone who's written about many longtime elected leaders in this state? You have some context with which to offer some input. What do you think? Where does Sam Reed and sort of his approach to politics and policy fit? Does he even have a place in 2024?
Sam has been talking me off a ledge for about 18 months. He's way more optimistic than I am, and we're taping this a week from one of the most polarizing, divisive elections in American history. In 2023, at the Washington State Historical Society Annual Awards presentation, the executive editor of the New Yorker magazine said something that knocked me for a loop, and I think when I surveyed the audience, I saw people gasp as well. Dorothy Wickenden said, "We must remember we're in a pre-Civil War society." It's pretty sobering stuff. I started covering the Washington legislature in 1966, but I cast my first vote in 1964 when Sam was on the hustings as a young volunteer for that 39-year-old future governor of Washington, Daniel J. Evans. I've really been fascinated lately. I had an enormous privilege to be with Governor Evans 3 days before he died. Our latest project upcoming is the 50th anniversary of the Indo-Chinese refugee relocation in Washington State. So I took with me State Representative Mi-Lin Tai, Democrat of Bellevue, our first ever refugee legislator, and Evans Nguyen, who was born about 5 months after his parents arrived at Camp Murray and named in honor of the Evanses. And Dan Evans answered the door looking hale and well, and I said, "Governor, it is my pleasure to introduce to you State Representative Mi-Lin Tai. The only thing wrong with her is that she's a Democrat." And he laughed and he reached out and they hugged. And we had a really marvelous hour-long discussion about civility and the lack of it in American politics. 3 days later, he was gone. I know both of you will remember, and it was Sam and Kim Wyman who gave me a really extraordinary mandate to finally get Dan Evans's autobiography into print. Probably one of the most daunting jobs I've ever had. But the real answer to your question is that Sam, with his civility and his sense of optimism and his all these years in the trenches, believes fervently that the pendulum will swing again, and I just see parallels to all sorts of really hateful things. You know, there's a really good book that if I could make it a companion to Mr. Mainstream, it's a book written by former diplomat Richard Haas, who worked at 4 White Houses, Democrats and Republicans alike, and it's called The Bill of Obligations. And this book is a wonderful read, and he talks about, we all know about the Bill of Rights, well, what are our obligations as citizens? And he posits in this: be informed, get involved, stay open to compromise, be civil, reject violence, value democratic norms, promote the common good, respect government service, support the teaching of civics, put country first. And then the last chapter he says, perhaps the most basic norm of American democracy is the tradition of accepting election results. Everything in this book personifies the career of Sam Sumner Reed and what he's brought to politics. So that was a long way of saying that I'm more pessimistic than, I'm holding my breath. I'm holding my breath that somehow the winner will accept, the loser will accept the election results, and that we move forward with more civility. And that's why I think Mr. Mainstream is such an important book right now.
Well, Secretary Reed, how did you, throughout a long career in public service, when there were disincentives to take a more middle-of-the-road approach, when there were tugs towards extremism, because historically, as you said, this has ebbed and flowed, how did you stay the course, especially when you were, and we'll talk in some detail about some specific moments along the way, but especially when you were feeling pressure from your own party?
We have a long history in the state of Washington of being more populist in the sense of not how the term is used now, but as it was in the formation of our state and then during the Theodore Roosevelt administration and such. Meaning the people have control over their elected officials. That's why our Constitution has so many separately elected officials, and we see so many in local government. And that's the way I always felt. We in this state have never been controlled by our political parties, either Democrats or Republicans. I always felt I answered to the people, and there were always many good Republicans who were encouraging me along the way. There were always some people who didn't like me at all and didn't like my moderate politics. But I always treated them with trust and engaged them with civility and all, and I think they appreciated it. And while I did have a couple of recall petitions filed against me during the Gregoire-Rossi issue, which you're going to be discussing, but I never really had a feeling that they were going to throw me out of the party or anything. And of course, they couldn't. That's not the way that we operate here in the state of Washington.
Well, so John Hughes, to some extent, I suppose a criticism of somebody who is middle of the road is that they aren't staking out a position. They don't have the courage of their conviction. They're not standing for something. The flip side of that is you're trying to compromise. You're looking to work across the aisle. You're trying to call balls and strikes not based on party affiliation, but based on what you see as the truth. Help us, as you wrote this book, what emerged for you in terms of the theme or the through line for the career of Secretary Reed, Sam Reed?
He made a really good point about the tradition of populism in Washington State, because of the so-called blanket primary, which he and Rob McKenna defended so eloquently all the way to the United States Supreme Court, and also the Open Public Records Act, a corollary to that, another victory. Well, the Grange and leftist forces, the Washington Commonwealth Federation of the 1930s, resisted the notion of filing for office, being forced to declare a party affiliation. what really emerged here in this story about Sam, and by the way, his grandfather Sam Sumner was a remarkable character. Earlier, I had done a book about the Woodses in the Wenatchee world, so where Sam and brother Roger and sister Janet grew up at least until for Roger and Sam, their high school years. And Wenatchee's a close-knit, very, very political town, and the story of his grandfather arriving there and the wide swath that grandfather very much opposed radical right-wing politics in the Republican Party. So Sam, as a legacy pledge, had this inclination to stake out civility, the pill of obligations, and to try to bring people together. I've been really amused lately in this election that after Governor Evans's death, then everyone is repeating his mantra, I would rather cross the political aisle than cross the people. They weren't making many of those noises before we lost our 3-term governor and U.S. Senator. There is, by the way, so he came by this by dint of lineage and temperament. His father also emerges in this story as being, I mean, it's almost too good to be true. As journalists, we always learned that the best way to ruin a real good story is to check it out. Well, his dad was a remarkably civil person. Sam had this wonderful line about his people used to say that the two things you don't want to discuss in polite company are politics and religion. Well, that's all his dad wanted to talk about, and somehow managed not to be offensive in doing it. So, by the way, there's a fascinating thing in one journalist to another, and now as a historian, that I tried mightily. The mandate from Sam Reed in the beginning and his wonderful deputy, Steve Excel, future state archivist, is we don't want any hagiographies in this program. Your job is that we recruited you as a historian and journalist to tell the truth, warts and all. It was very, very difficult to get people to go on the record to say bad things about Sam Sumner Reed. I had one that I thought was going to give me some added perspective, who is still really, really PO'd about the Gregoire-Rossi race. And when I said, well, that's a good counterpoint to this, and then can't use it, it's off the record. So, but there weren't many of those. I think he came by this by dint of the way he was raised. And I love the story in the beginning about young Sam Reed in Portland. He's got his little red wagon stuffed with flyers for Harold Stassen, the wonder boy of Republican progressive politics, and there you go. You don't get better antecedents than that.
In the Oregon primary.
In the Oregon primary.
Right. Well, Austin, I want to take issue with your question and the premise of the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Have at it.
You will find, and I think it's in the book, it wasn't like I never took a position and just was looking to compromise. Throughout my career, I have championed many causes. Many of them have been controversial, but I've been willing to fight for what I believed in and cared about. And so I have very strong convictions and really worked them hard. Now, I was not a political extremist, so it wasn't anything polemical, but when you talk about the political middle, you're talking about a pretty big area to operate in. And but I certainly never shied away from taking strong stands on issues.
Well, let's talk about the 2004 election, because that really was a test of a lot of things. Our system, your role as Secretary of State, and trust in elections. And you had to navigate this months-long kind of agonizing process that included ballots being discovered in King County that had been set aside, that included recounts, leads switching back and forth, and then ultimately an election trial in Chelan County. And through it all, you're trying to navigate this and not winning many friends along the way. Take us back to that time and sort of, what did you tell yourself when you woke up each morning? about how to navigate this when you were under such intense pressure and the stakes are so high?
I was fortunate in that I previously was Thurston County Auditor. And as Thurston County Auditor, I had 2 congressional district recounts. I had a really contentious state Senate recount, and then a number of other races. And so I really knew what I was doing.
You knew elections. You were
And
confident in your knowledge of how elections
I-
are administered.
I
You
knew
had a
the-
background in
I knew
that.
the laws, I knew the rules, I knew the previous, decisions that had been made in courts. Now, of course, you have to review all this, but I always felt that, I had to do the right thing, and that I had a pretty clear sense of what was the right thing. And so, in fact, I think it's in the book, one of the questions that I was asked in the middle of being just pilloried by both parties and being, the news media, and back at that time, there was much more, active Capitol Press Corps and radio stations that were all news in Spokane and Seattle and all. And so they were just after me day and night, as well as, members of the public who were upset. In fact, one experience I had that was that at that time I would get up at 5:45 in the morning, I would get coffee, sit down, start reading the paper, and at 6:05, too many times, my phone would ring. Hello, is this Secretary of State Sam Reed? Yes, it is. You're on the air, Hot Talk Radio. Have at 'em. This is Secretary of State Sam Reed himself, and right away, my mother-in-law in Issaquah didn't get her absentee ballot. What are you going to do about that, Sam Reed?
So they have callers calling in.
Yeah, right. Just live. I'm
Yeah,
on the
and,
air.
and you
so,
you haven't even finished your first cup of coffee.
So it was, pretty lively and.
But in those moments when, especially when you had such pressure from your own party, and one of the issues, if I understood correctly and remember correctly, is should the universe of votes that were counted on election night be the universe of votes that we're dealing with here, or should we consider votes that may have been, because of some error, discounted, set aside, and not actually counted, maybe not for a good reason, but that's what happened. And again, if I'm remembering correctly, you came down on the side of, let's take a look. Let's see what they found in King County. And if these were voters that are about to be disenfranchised, we probably need to count those. That was a controversial call.
It was, Austin, and it wasn't just in King County. We had counties throughout the state. In fact, I think 23 counties that had problems and problem ballots. I had a clear conviction that the first concern is for the voter, himself or herself. If this person participated in our election, did what they thought was the right thing, and got their ballot in, ought to be counted if there is proof that this ballot was properly secured and this wasn't something that was just cooked up. Like one thing happened in King County was ballots were left in the base of some voting machines out in poll sites, and they were brought in, and the question was, should they be counted? Well, my answer was no, because they weren't secured. They were sitting in a high school gymnasium. And the King County Canvassing Board agreed. But by the way, it's not the Secretary of State's decision. It is the County Canvassing Board. But that was what was fundamental to me, Austin, is we need to do right by the voters.
John Hughes, in this climate, again, where election officials are under such scrutiny, attack, we've seen it in this state, certainly seen it in other states. And you think about the climate in 2004 versus the climate now, some respects, even though I imagine the pressure was immense and intense, it was a different time. Do you have any sort of comparison and contrast or some thoughts about?
Well, you can fast forward to 2020 when Secretary of State Wyman, who had earned her spurs as an election official in Thurston County under Sam, and her elections director were under such hateful torrents of hate that they had full-time state patrol protection. Sam said, you asked a terrific question earlier about the courage, a profile in courage to stand up for what's right, and Sam just italicized that, talking about this norm, respecting democratic norms, the voter. Well, both the Democrat and Republican parties wanted Sam's head on a platter over the issue of the blanket primary. They insisted and had a U.S. Supreme Court decision out of California that predated this that said that the freedom of association of the political parties gave them the right to dictate who could be in their club, so to speak. So everything got really tedious when a stopgap was that we had to have a pick-a-party primary. And our friend and Sam's former communications director, Trovo Heffernan, remembers what a travail that was, with the phone ringing off the hook and the most vile kinds of comments, because Washingtonians were incensed that they were going to have to, in essence, register in a primary to be a Republican or a Democrat.
We were used to the open primary.
Absolutely. Yeah. It was an article of faith.
Well, so this is another key period or moment. It was multiple chapters in your career, and it also occupies a good chunk of this book, and that is this fight over our open or blanket primary and the parties trying to assert control of the primary so that they could essentially nominate their own candidates and then require people to pick a Democratic slate or a Republican slate, a Libertarian slate, whatever the case may be. It's one thing to take the side of voters and say, I think your vote should count, and I'll go up against my own party when they're mad about me calling balls and strikes and that. It's quite another to go up against the political parties. Now, maybe today there's a little bit more independence or the ability to fundraise outside of the party apparatus, but in those days, party was everything. They were funding campaigns. You needed them in many respects. Maybe you personally didn't, but statewide office candidates normally do. So what was the calculation there, and how did you think that through? I'm going to take on the political parties. Isn't there a thing in politics, you dance with the one that brung you?
We talked a lot about my grandfather, and I always had, a kind of a certain love for Washington State and its history, and was really convinced that we had it right here in the state of Washington. And in terms of elections, what that means is people of the state said, I want to vote the person, not the party. I want, as an individual voter in the state of Washington, to be able to decide which candidate is better prepared, better qualified, whatever, however they want to make their decision. And so when this came up, I never had a question. In fact, it was my first campaign for Secretary of State 2000, because this Supreme Court decision in California that John was talking about was decided right in the middle of that race. So I was asked, and my big challenge, Austin, was not myself, because the parties could go after me all they wanted, but I knew what I needed to do, but was to convince the partisan legislators who are much more partisan on the whole than we statewide officials, and who have party caucuses, who work with the parties in terms of electing people, to get them to go along with me
with legislation
for the top two primary, which I proposed, and I succeeded in doing that. But I think it was a kind of a profile of courage for them
to sort of again say no to the party, yes to this idea.
Because the parties were there; they were pounding the table. I mean, they weren't mildly saying, I don't think this is a good idea. They were pounding the table.
Yep. We do need to take a quick break. We'll pick this up in just a moment. When we return, we continue our interview with former Secretary of State Sam Reed and historian John Hughes. Back right after this.
Watch all of TVW's award-winning shows on your time at tvw.org.
And welcome back to Inside Olympia. Joining me once again is former Secretary of State Sam Reed and also historian John Hughes, author of a new book about Secretary Reed. So this top two, the fight over our primary eventually makes it to the Supreme Court, which also demonstrates how high the stakes were and how far the parties were willing to go, as well as how far those of you who wanted to defend the blanket primary were going to go. So tell us about the stakes when you are taking a case like that up against, again, the political parties all the way to the United States Supreme Court.
Austin, the day that I was sworn in as Secretary of State the first time, January 10, 2001, we were having a nice lunch and everybody celebratory and all, and a guy walks in and serves me papers. The Washington State Democratic Party, Washington State Republican Party, Washington State Libertarian Party versus Sam Reed. And I said, what? Welcome to office. And this was a lawsuit over our blanket primary. I dealt with that issue one way or another through all 12 years of my service.
It did feel like it was never ending.
Yeah, and the stakes were high. What John was alluding to earlier was when I worked really hard, got the top two primary through the legislature in 2004, with some tremendous help from some key leadership in the legislature on both sides of the aisle. Governor Locke, much to our surprise, did an item veto on it and took out the top two primary. So I was the foremost champion of letting the people have a right to decide how they want to vote. Ended up having to oversee a primary where people had to pick the party. Yeah. And this is
people were not happy.
This is what John was referring to. The day the ballots started arriving, my office received 16,000 calls. We had to hire people for a phone bank and the emails, and many of them were even a bit obscene, but they just viewed it as their fundamental right as Americans. And so the stakes were very high for the people, but also for the parties. The parties had always wanted, and very understandably, I think if I were a party leader, I would want to have more control over it and to limit the people who would participate. But I always felt I had the high ground in terms of arguing this case, and I felt that we succeeded in articulating it. It's fundamental issues of participation of people in a democracy is having the right to decide in a primary as well as the general who you want to vote for each office and not have it limited. And what is interesting, Austin, is and evidence of the validity of this view is the more restrictive primaries are, like if you have to register to vote by party, then you can only vote. That's by far the smallest primary turnout. And then as it moves up, if you just have to pick a party ballot, that's lower. But ours is the largest turnout by far around the country.
When people don't have to declare
That's right.
an association or affiliation. John Hughes, this as he said, it was a saga, a multi-year saga. And it goes all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. On the one hand, you could argue he was on the side of the people, certainly not on the side of the parties. It gets to the U.S. Supreme Court. What's your observation about this chapter in Washington state history and in the career of Secretary Reed?
There's my favorite passage. The best thing about modern technology is all these transcripts and oral arguments are available online. So I was just listening to hour upon hour of these arguments, and Justice David Souter, who's a hard-nosed jurist, was talking to McKenna and says, do you know of any Democrats who go around saying, I prefer the Democratic Party, who do not regard themselves and register themselves as Democrats? I mean, in the real world, it seems to me the distinction you're drawing is simply not drawn. Putting it another way, do you know any people who go around saying, well, I really prefer the Democrats. I'm a Republican myself. I mean, that doesn't happen, does it? And McKenna shoots back, well, how about Joe Lieberman in Connecticut? And then Souter comes back and says, well, there's always one. And the courtroom erupts in laughter. I mean, it was, the arguments were just masterful in that. What Sam didn't say is that on that first day, or soon after he was elected, one of the first people to accost him was Attorney General Slade Gorton, who put a heavy hand on his shoulder and said, what are you going to do about our primary? And Sam said, what? What primary? He hadn't heard about the decision yet.
He knew already.
I was actually at a campaign picnic in King County in July of 2000 when I was running, and Slade Gorton came over and said that. And I was startled, and he said, you need to fight this. You need to fight this. So.
This was not the only time a case went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court during your tenure. It happened again around the state's Public Disclosure Act and whether signatures on a ballot measure, to qualify a ballot measure, should be kept private, secret, not disclosed. This was in the context of an effort to, I believe, repeal not marriage equality, but everything but essentially domestic partnerships plus.
Right.
Which is you get all of the benefits of marriage, but we don't call it marriage. It was R71. And what the proponents of that repeal effort were saying is people who signed this are going to be exposed, if their names are out there, to hate or vitriol or whatever, any number of things. You disagreed?
I certainly did. I worked a lot with the legislature over the years, and could you imagine a legislator who said, I want to sponsor a bill, I want to support this bill, but I want to keep it secret? And guess what? Initiatives and referenda are, they are legislation.
It's the people, but it's legislating by initiative, by referenda.
That's right.
That's the analogy
That's
you're making,
right.
as
So,
opposed to like a secret ballot.
That is correct. And that was the position I took, and again, I thought was very clear, but again, it ended up being very controversial, and they fought it tooth and nail, and it went all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And it was a fascinating case, both that one and the top two. I was there for both of them, and they were fascinating to watch, and a number of times the justices would refer to me, but of course I wasn't up there. It was the Attorney General. But it was really a interesting case in terms of participation in the political arena. And you're right, you're going to get some heat sometimes, and you're going to get heat for where you stand and all that, but that's part of participation in our political system.
Did you ever waver on either of these issues, the party primary or the blanket primary, or on this disclosure piece? Did you ever think to yourself, am I right about this? Are my convictions leading me astray? Did you ever have a doubt?
One advantage of having so many years, having served as elected official, and in this case as county auditor for many years before Secretary of State, is I was steeped in these issues. I had extensive experience in these issues. And so I certainly knew where I stood, and I did not have any second thoughts on it.
What about being an elected Republican in a state with mostly elected, at least at a statewide level, Democrats? What was that dynamic like, and how did that influence your thinking, affect how you interacted? I mean, it would have been very different if you had been in a state where all statewide office holders were fellow Republicans. That wasn't the case here. You were sometimes the only one.
Well, that was my situation in Thurston County as well. Overall, where I was county auditor, overall it was a pretty Democratic county. And in fact, when I first was county auditor, I was the only Republican elected official, though added a few more as we went along. It was not an issue other than I had to do what was instinctual to me, which was to work on a bipartisan basis. So if I was going to champion an issue, I've talked with all four caucuses, and I found allies in all four caucuses. But, that's just the smart thing to do anyway. And the reason it's smart is that you want your legislation to last. If you just make it a partisan issue and ram it through, guess what? When the other party gets a majority, they're going to undo it. So I always viewed that as fundamental to the process to work with both parties.
Is there some political lessons, John Hughes, to take away here in terms of, or leadership lessons that maybe do stand the test of time, even if we're in polarized times? You can tell that, and we know that Sam Reed was a political science student, wrote his master's thesis on this, is a student of politics as much as an expert in election administrations and other things. So when you think about sort of that blend of having some subject matter expertise, but also being pretty politically savvy, what are some takeaways or lessons?
It goes back again to Grandpa Sam Sumner and the lessons that and then that crucible, if you will, of Sam being involved in that landmark 1964 campaign when young Dan Evans, who started out in that race as the darkest of dark horses and slowly closed the ground. And the way they did that was from brilliant campaign advice by future U.S. Congressman, Lieutenant Governor Joel Pritchard, who was just masterful at that. But these people involved in remaking the Republican Party at that time were classic progressive Republicans in the sense of Teddy Roosevelt's.
This was the action team.
Fast
developed into it.
Fast forward to 1968, and the first ever political ticket in Washington State, at least that we could find, for Dan Evans for re-election for governor, A. Ludlow Kramer, Secretary of State re-election, Slade Gorton for Attorney General, and then one of the great what might have beens in Washington history, an African-American city councilman from the Tri-Cities, Arthur Fletcher, whom they recruited to be the candidate for lieutenant governor. And I mean, and there's a great story in here about how incredulous Arthur Fletcher was when Sam Reed went to him and said, "Hey, Art, we think we have just the guy to run for lieutenant governor." And Fletcher said, "Who would that be?" And said, "It's you." And Fletcher was this bigger-than-life presence, maybe 6'3", 250 pounds, former pro football player, and he roared back and he looked at it and said, "You're saying that an African-American from Pasco who's never stood for statewide office is a viable candidate for lieutenant governor?" And Sam said, "That's exactly what we're saying." Well, the rest of that story is that in the wake of a racist screed in the dying days of that election, everyone in the action team except Arthur Fletcher won, and he was narrowly defeated by a cadre of racists. So the thing that's fascinating to me about having been really, at least casting my first vote in that 1964 election, and then covering politics and action for Washington, is that these mainstreamers, they're an endangered species as far as I'm concerned in Washington politics. Now, Sam, in whom I have a great deal of faith, says the pendulum's going to swing back to the middle, hopefully, but it's tedious. It's tedious for the mainstream Republicans to stake out the center when there are so many MAGA Trumpers who have, to my mind, hijacked the Republican Party. I was absolutely stunned that in the news deserts that are now in Washington State and all around America, the John Birch Society in Pacific County was vetting candidates for the Washington legislature and getting a lot of credit for it. And all I could do was flash back to Daniel J. Evans reading the Birchers out of the Republican Party. He says there's no room for extremists, false prophets. It's a very challenging time.
So, Secretary Reed, you have kind of articulated an optimistic view that the pendulum swings and we may come back to some period of more moderation. But what is your view and impression and analysis of the state of the modern day Republican Party and the Donald Trump wing of that and what he's been able to do? How are you making sense of this as a longtime, lifelong Republican and somebody who, and the founder of the mainstream Republicans of this state?
I look around the world and I see that this brand of populism and nationalism is not unique to America. And it certainly was a nerve that Donald Trump managed to tap when he decided to run in the first primary contest in 2016. And I think we've learned from this how alienated some people have been, as we have championed, I have championed, free and fair trade, and Washington State has become, most trade-dependent state in the United States. People, because of technology, no longer have their jobs. Down in John's area, the harbor area, there used to be loggers and mill workers in their situation now. We've seen yellow dog Democratic counties that have turned Republican down there. And so I think we have a lot to learn from that, but also I think in the long run to govern is what is important. And that's why I'm confident that we're going to come back to it. And why I say I'm not just sitting here with wishful thinking, gee, someday, things are going to be good again. We are out there actively working, recruiting candidates, training candidates, helping them win so that we do have a base here in the state of Washington. And this is really being done around the country to a degree.
You saw the fractiousness and kind of tumult at the state Republican convention this summer. I know the book quotes Chris Gergen, who was the campaign manager for Lauren Culp, who ran for governor 4 years ago, saying it's hard for constitutional-minded Republicans to find much in common with mainstream Republicans. The divides within the Republican Party right now, and how do you see that being repaired? So you can recruit mainstream candidates and I suppose try to push the pendulum in the other direction, but how do you knit this party, the grand old party, back together again?
I've had some experience watching it, and it has actually taught me some patience, because I must say that I was more like John before. Oh my God, things are going, the world's going to fall apart. Back in the 1964 time period and in the 60s, the radical right was very involved in the Republican Party. They took over the National Convention of the Cow Palace, which is analogous to what you're talking about, what happened in our state this year. And some people were saying, as went through the election in Goldwater, not only got slaughtered, but we lost a huge number of congressmen, legislators, and there were obituaries being written about the Republican Party. Well, guess what? A couple of years later, boom, bounced right back and did very well. And then we saw where the religious conservatives kind of began taking over the party, the whole Pat Robertson episode and all that. And we had, I don't know if you were at the convention in Republican convention, Yakima County, which they call the Witchcraft Platform Convention. But again, people were doing obituaries on the Republican Party. And I've just seen that through different episodes. And what happens is that some of these people that come in with fire in their belly and pretty extreme views learn, I think, through the process of who actually can get elected, how to work in the political process and begin to work to accommodate those who are already in the party. And I think we're going to see that again.
Just briefly, do you think our open primary has had a moderating effect on our politics or elected leaders in this state?
I do think that, because what I've seen is when there are two people of one party in the races, in most of the races, what happens is that the person who's more the centrist ends up getting elected. And a good example is a couple of years ago with Dan Newhouse getting elected, and I hope, personally, I hope that's the case this year as well.
As a member of Congress from the
Fourth
Tri-Cities
District
area.
in
Yeah.
Central Washington, right? Yeah.
Okay, we have just a few minutes left, and we've talked about sort of efforts in your career to, in some ways, maintain the status quo, right? Not change the primary system, or to preserve it. On the other side of the ledger, you ushered in significant change, and certainly vote by mail is probably the most dramatic example. But to this day, and in particular today, there are challenges once again to this system. There was somebody setting fire to ballot boxes down in Southwest Washington, and I think one on the Oregon side, leading to the state Republican Party chair to say we need to abandon this and go back to the polls. So I want to hear your current views on vote by mail.
I was early champion. In fact, it was the county auditor's legislative committee that really worked hard to get vote by mail through the legislature on a limited basis, then it expanded over the years. I think it has been very successful. It certainly has worked in terms of increasing participation in some of the local elections, and particularly special elections and odd-year primaries. We have really mastered how to do it well and to get security. What precipitated a lot of this anti-vote by mail that we're seeing this year and that we saw in 2022 was because of COVID. Most other states all of a sudden had to figure out how to do it, and rammed it through. And of course, when they saw the results of the election, they really got upset about it. So, but I do think that it's going to continue to spread throughout the country, and it's going to be an acceptable way of participation, of people participating in elections.
So despite the criticisms, you're still holding your ground on this, saying
Absolutely.
this was the right decision and we should stick with it.
That is
No
absolutely
going
correct.
back. Okay. John Hughes, what's a final takeaway here about this book, this career, and how we should be contextualizing it in our modern times?
It's a profile in courage. It's somebody who is steeped in civility and the norms of democratic government from early childhood, who in a long and distinguished political career exemplified all those. If we have a second, I would tell you my favorite Sam Reed story, though. Early on, Sam and I were on the road touring the Long Beach Peninsula, and I learned from other key aides when I was a rookie that Sam's a creature of habit. He needs a latte at a certain time, and I think a strawberry milkshake at another, if I recall. So we stopped at a espresso stand in suburban South Bend along the Willapa River, and I introduced the young barista. I said, "Say, this is your Secretary of State, Sam Reed." And this young woman looked out and said, "You must be very good at taking notes," which I thought was wonderful. Sam laughed.
That's good. Sam Reed, you get the final word here. What do you want people to reflect upon if they read this book and after this conversation? Just briefly.
That a boy from Wenatchee, Washington, who was not wealthy, who did not have statewide connections, who wasn't supported by any big corporations or big unions, can succeed, and mainly by getting in, working hard, doing the right thing, learning, building a record. And when I ran for Secretary of State in 2000, I literally ran on my record of being somebody who would bring knowledge to the Office of Secretary of State in terms of elections and records and licensing.
Okay. I'm going to stop you there. Congratulations to both of you again on the book.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Good to reconnect with you, Secretary Reed. Nice to see you, John Hughes.
Thank you.
The book, again, is Mr. Mainstream, Sam Reed's Half-Century of Public Service and Civility, and it is now available through the Secretary of State's office in Legacy,
Absolutely,
Washington.
or at the Secretary of State's main office in the store in the basement of the Capitol.
Okay.
And selected other leading book outlets.
Great. Thank you for watching Inside Olympia. We will see you again next week.